Alright everyone, it's time to lock in because we got a new Ice Earth Guardian spoiled to us in the 5th anniversary livestream. This is Jarl. This is pretty cool for a number of reasons. It's the first time that we have gotten Ice and Earth as like a dual element back into the game since Oldhim left, right? Still in the same class as before. This is pretty interesting because it's the first time we've really seen a hero care about empty equipment zones, specifically for your opponent's side of the table. So specifically being able to give a Frostbite to every empty slot that your opponent has on their field. So at the end of the game, if they have 0 somehow, you could give them potentially 4 Frostbites if you play 4 ice cards in a turn. Realistically, you're normally only going to be giving them 1 to 2 Frostbites. But that's a really powerful effect, right? I need to give a really big caveat to today's list, right? Today's list is with the day 1 spoilers that they gave us. We are missing some Majestics, I'm assuming. We're specifically missing the equipment and the weapon, okay? So we do know that I think if you break down the math, I think we're missing like 3 Majestics from the deck in terms of actual cards that will be in it, not the equipment or the weapon. My assumption is that some of those, like 3 cards missing from the main board are probably going to be reprints. I don't know how many. I don't know how impactful the new weapon or the armor will be. It's entirely possible that the new equipments and weapons entirely change the trajectory of the list, right? Today's list is mainly ice focused because currently, based off the card pool that we have, it seems like ice is the best strategy for this hero. Now, it could be the weapon and the armor care a bunch about earth, right? So far, the hero text cares about ice, so we'll see where the equipment wants to pull it. If they actually really did design this as a dual element hero, or if it was mainly an ice guardian that has the essence of earth to make Oldhim cards playable again, right? We won't even claim that this list is anywhere near solved because we are missing a huge piece of the puzzle. What this is going to do though is hopefully put you on the right track for your own brewing as more cards come out, and of course we're going to recover this hero multiple times. I'm very excited about this guy, but also to give you an idea of like maybe what you want to buy, right? Because I've seen the prices go nuts. I jumped the gun on some alt-art CLFs myself, fingers crossed TCG player order is not canceled. The prices are nuts right now. So hopefully you look at this and maybe get some ideas about what cards you maybe don't want to buy. Spoiler alert, don't buy Mangle, it's in the starter. Deck building this is actually pretty simple if you have come from the previous time of Oldhim. So a bit of Tekla Foundry lore. I got in the game with Oldhim. Oldhim was my first hero. It was my first starter. I joined basically right at the Tales of Aria launch, somewhere in between like November to December of 2021. So Oldhim was my introduction. Oldhim was what I wanted to play. I actually, ironically, started the Tekla Foundry and started making Dash content because I actually couldn't afford to play Oldhim. Oldhim was like over $1,000 at the time. Rainbow Foil Rampart was like $150. The prices for Fab were absurd. Now they are still absurd. Even in some cases they're even more absurd now. Actually, I would probably say that they've gotten even more ridiculous. At the time, I couldn't afford it. I was a senior in college, and so I played Dash. Someone in my local scene recommended Dash to me. They told me it's like $150 if you really want to kit it out, but you can play for even less. And I built the deck for probably less than $100. And I won an armory with it in the Seattle scene, which is pretty competitive. It was really sick that I was able to do it with an Iron Rot helm, right, instead of Skull Cap at the time, because Skull Cap was your best in slot. But needless to say, I grew the channel off of Dash content because I couldn't afford to play Oldhim. So it wasn't what I was playing at the time. Now as time went on, I graduated and I accumulated some funds. I dove into Oldhim at the end of his run. So Blitz, CC, I was playing Oldhim in person all the time. I was an absolute menace in my local scene. You get pairings and people would sigh when they realized that they were paired into me because, we were going to have a good full-time run. It makes it a little bit easier to build this hero because I just have so much experience, playing against this hero, losing to this hero, building it myself, seeing other people's builds, following what the Oldhim lists were doing as time went on, especially towards the end of his run. So yeah, pretty simple stuff. So let's run through top to bottom. We'll start with the equipment. These are all placeholders. The only card here that I think probably will mainly stay is Stalagmite. Stalagmite is insane. You know how your opponent's deck plays and you're able to prevent them from attacking with an entire card at the end of their turn, especially if you can get them to IP themselves, right? So if they were actually not going to be able to play anything, or they have to pitch their card now to play something from Arsenal, whatever the case may be, if you get your opponent in a spot where you can, read what their turn is and you stop them from playing an entire card, add whatever that card value was and put it on top of the block value for Stalagmite. The most obvious one back in my day was Briar swinging Rosetta Thorn at the end, right? It was super telegraphed. They would not have Tunic up, or they would have Tunic up sometimes, and they'd play out their whole line, and all the cards are gone, and you know that the one floating left over is going into a Rosetta swing for 2 and 2, let's say. So you block with Stalagmite, they can't swing Rosetta Thorn, and then you just gained yourself 4 health, right? So the Stalagmite essentially blocked for 6. Do that again, and then it's worth 5, right? Because you block for 1, you know, whatever the damage prevention is, and then you don't take the 4 on the weapon swing, right? So add that up, this armor piece is worth 11 health on 1 offhand shield, right? That's insane. This obviously is not good in every single matchup. You probably don't want to play this in the mirror. You, as a new player, maybe who has not played with Stalagmite before, you're gonna have to learn how to use this effectively. This is like the equivalent of Fleshbag, except better. I think it will be hard for them to print something better than Tunic. We'll see, but Tunic just fits into a lot of what you want to do. So my assumption is that it's staying, but we will see, right? Let's go into the rest of the list. Something that's going to be kind of interesting to some people is the lack of, you know, -1 counters, buckling blows. Here's the deal. You don't need to try to destroy your opponent's equipment. You really only need 1 gone, right? You're rarely going to play more than 1 ice card. I'll just go ahead and show you all of our main board right here. You're not going to play more than 1 ice card most of the time. Sometimes you might get to play like Winter's Bite into something else, or you'll get to play like maybe CLF into something else, but it's probably not another ice card, right? So maybe 2. Your opponent's playing Flesh and Blood. They're going to do that themselves. The entire selling point of this game is the fact that your opponent gets to cash in their armor, right? That's the whole thing. You have your deck and then you have your equipment, right? The equipment is there to block. Equipment is there to get used for its one-time effect. Think about every single time people complain about a matchup as like Guardian or something that's playing trying to play Disruption, right? You say like, oh, Dash IO. Well, we can't even CNC or Erase Facer anymore because she has like an 8 block on Fridge. And it's like, yeah, she gets it once, right? She has to cash in to do a power turn. After that, it's gone, right? So it makes it easier, right? The whole point is that they need to cash in their equipment. They're going to do that at some point in the game. Azalea is going to use snaps. She is going to block with Tunic. It may happen later than you want, but I think it's fine because this deck naturally has the ability to grind the game out to the point where you are going to be in a situation where your opponent doesn't have 1 piece of equipment anymore, right? That's the biggest thing, is I don't think you need to jam in all this arsenal, or all of this equipment destruction. You do want to play Mangle, of course. I think this one is a given, but some of this other stuff you could be playing, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think you need to play Buckling Blows or anything like that. We're of course going to run Crumbled to Eternity because this card is actually really powerful, and you can think about things like Exposed to the Elements, but your opponent is going to break their equipment on their own. They're going to play Flesh and Blood. And if the fork that you're presenting to your opponent is that they never want to use their equipment to block, to use for their effect because then your hero power's online, you are winning tremendously. Imagine your opponent not wanting to use Crown on CNC for their power turn because now they're worried that you now have a hero power. That's an incredible fork. And I think that you'll actually have a lot of leverage based on the fact that your opponent actively doesn't want to use their equipment. And this deck is perfectly fine without having the hero power for a good majority of the game. Just keep that in mind. I don't think you need to be playing a bunch of over-the-top stuff to force equipment destruction. Your opponent's playing Flesh and Blood. You are going to use them. And if your thought process is, I'm not going to use them to make sure my opponent can't turn on their Jarl, you're losing. Your equipment is still face down the whole game. What are you doing, right? You have to play into it. So we have really generic good Guardian stuff. We have CNCs, we have E-Strikes, we have Spinal. You've seen all these before. We're running Tunic, of course, so we can CNC Pummel, we can Spinal Pummel, we can Mangle Pummel without Tunic. When you go into the blues here, we got good Raid Guardian blues, right? We got Cranial, we got Thunderquake, we got Macho, we got Rouse. Good hand conversion. When you time walk your opponent a bunch using Frostbites, you're going to need to throw damage back at them. You're going to need this for the mirror. You're going to need this for Illusionist, specifically Enigma. We have good closing threats, right? Blue Glacial, Blue Macho. These are just going to close the game out on the spot. If your opponent goes down to 5, doesn't have anything left beyond their 3 blocks, they're dead. When we go up into more of the reds here, I do want to point out Frostfang. I actually think Frostfang is pretty cool. I would say this is probably on the chopping block of cards, but I do want to mention it. I think it's actually really powerful because it's an ice card, right? So whenever you play it with Jarl, you're making a Frostbite. Attack with it, you make the Frostbite, and then there's also the on hit, right? So let's say you're playing against like a Redline Aurora deck or something like that, right? Their hand is all 0 for 4s most of the time, right? 0 cost effects. They take it, they lose a card, They now have a Frostbite. They have to pitch to play a card on their turn. You've removed 2 cards from their hand. This says on hit, like lose 2 cards. I think that's incredibly powerful. You can also pummel it. The downside of this is that I think we already have enough aggro hate in the sideboard, and also it is a 2-block, so I could see this being replaced with something else. So I want to put this in here for a bit of fun spice. We obviously need to test this out and see how well it does. I could see this not making the final cut, but it does in the vacuum seem pretty powerful. We are running Unforgetting. This is just test of strength, but it tutors for the exact card that you want, which is Mangle. I think that this is powerful enough. Like I said, you don't want too much of these destructive style crush effects. Most of them are pretty bad, and your opponent's going to break their armor anyway, but this one's insane because this is test of strength unconditional, right? Well, there is a small condition, but it'll probably be met. And so I think that this is very strong. I've kind of considered cutting this down to 2 because you don't always want to see this card. If you see it too early, it's entirely pointless beyond it being a 4-block. If you see it by the time all your mangles are gone, it's also bad. So I am considering going down to 2 on this. I just haven't figured out what other card I want to increase or add. When we go through the rest of the blues here, we have some elemental ones. So Tomorrow is a huge one. So for anyone who's familiar with Oldhim, this is a huge mirror breaker. I mean, it didn't matter because Oldham's played this anyway, so it's not like you ever caught your Oldhim opponent without this card. But now that people are going to be playing Jarl and maybe trying to try out different earth cards or different blue ratios, whatever, I can imagine some Jarl players may forget to include this. You need this card. It lets you recycle your Oakenhold, right, which is your huge finisher, not an Oldhim specialization for some reason. This card is huge. Don't worry about the earth to ice ratios. You're not playing this to raw fuse it every single time. This is a pitch stacking tool. You're playing this into control, you're playing this into mid-range, you're playing this into decks where you are forcing the game to go into second cycle. And your pitch stack is absolutely insane, right? It's a little bit harder without Crown of Seeds compared to when Oldhim got to do it, but this is still very much achievable. You don't really value this card based on how easy it is to play it the second you draw it. A lot of the times in aggro anyway, you're going to be blocking 3 with this. So don't sweat it. Don't worry about the ratio of how likely this is to always be live if you stick in an arsenal or if you draw it with 3 other cards. You're playing this in pitch stack. And so that's something you just got to, learn as a skill with this card, is how to pitch stack appropriately with it. So, but So Tomorrow is huge. It'll let you recycle these back in the deck. And as long as, throughout the game, you've been pitching your earth cards and your ice cards, right? And you do have these dual element ones, so you can pitch your crumbles, you're going to pitch your Pulse of Eisenloft. Your pitch stack's going to be insane. And if you're just recurring these with So, you can get all the way up to, beyond, obviously way beyond the 3 copies. You can double your play set, right, of Oakenhold. That's going to win every single slow attrition game. And if you have it and your opponent doesn't, and you're playing like a mirror or some other really grindy, second, third cycle based matchup, you have it locked in. So don't forget to add this card. We have Winter's Bite. We'll see if this wants to get replaced with any of the new cards that they're adding, if there's any more, ice cards or earth cards that are blues. This card's really good, right? Late game, you're going to play this. It's going to rip a card from hand and give them a Frostbite. It's also very good into aggro. Winter's Grasp is your block 3, same with Autumn's Touch. A small caveat is you can actually play Winter's Grasp and give your opponent a Frostbite, which is pretty cool. It may come up in some endgame scenario, so keep that in mind. And we, of course, have Channel Lake Frigid. This card is broken into so many decks. Basically anything that's not playing 1 game action per turn. It's like bad in the mirror, and that's like basically it. It wrecks pretty much every other deck. This card is incredible. Just adding a generic tax to everything your opponent wants to do. It's so backbreaking for so many decks. I'm sure people have more experience playing against this one because of Icelander. It's a little bit worse than the Guardians because you don't get to play it at instant speed, treat the extra turn with the Coronet Peak, plus the turn it's on the field without the flow counter. Playing it at instant speed I think is really insane. I think the card is a bit more fair played on your turn. Normally in the Guardians it lasts for about 1 turn less. A lot of the times in Icelander it's on the table for 2 or 3 turns. I would say in the Guardians, like specifically Oldhim, it was 1 to 2 maybe. So it will be more balanced, of course, but this card is still insane. Channel Mount Eisen is a difficult one to pin down. I really don't know how useful it's going to be in terms of pinging the damage at the end of the game. I will say though, I could see grindy attrition games going down to a few health and you're blocking back and forth. You play this and the game is just over, right? You give them 1 Frostbite, it's a wrap, right? So, or you play this, you play Winter's Bite, you pitch to play something, they're gonna take 2, game's over on the spot. So The generic life loss is actually pretty powerful, so I actually do see this as a decent closer. The main reason we're playing it is that number in the bottom right that says block 3. So that's it for our main board. Let's go into our sideboard. We mainly have a bunch of aggro tech as well as some stuff for the mirror. We're currently only running AB1. I do see it being pretty likely that we may need to adjust that based on meta, right? This is going to be a huge thing with Guardian, right? You are going to adjust this deck based on what your meta is, what you want to do. There's so many different ways that you can build Guardian. You can build Guardian to basically be anything if you have the sideboard space for it. So for this, we're trying out some stuff, right? We get Blizzard back, incredible into aggro, just shutting down their go again, especially into red line decks. This is basically like a time walk to their entire turn past their first card that they play. Like you imagine playing this into Aurora when she plays like Lightning Surge and she doesn't have a blue, like her turn's just over. Hypothermia is incredibly toxic. I unfortunately remember having to play against this card as Dash. Awful, right? It just shutting down the go again. Boost doesn't work. Conditional effects like Mandible Claw or Lightning Surge no longer work. This card is really powerful, and it is essentially a Rend the Ledger that you just get to play as a blue. It doesn't have to hit, you just play it and it's Rend the Ledger into a bunch of decks. So this is something that you definitely should consider playing. This card is very, very impactful, along with Blizzard. It's a combination of the two that make it like really backbreaking. One more piece of aggro tech is Red Arctic. Red Arctic is going to be insane into so many low to the ground curve decks, right? Like you think something like Azalea, who a lot of the times will just use Tunic Counter to just pay for Death Dealer, low to 0 cost, play 4 pumps and send the arrow, right? You give them 4 Frostbites, you essentially time walk them. They like can't do anything. Maybe they have a yellow to load their 1 cost arrow. Once again, that Death Dealer is going to cost 4 resources, and that's not to mention if they have an empty equipment zone, this creates 4 Frostbites, right? So that Death Dealer is going to cost 5. They're not going to be able to play. It's essentially Warmongers, but even better. They can't do anything. Red Arctic seems really powerful into the aggro decks. The entire point of this deck is slowing down the pace of the game to force your opponent to still present threats, burn out of their reds, and then outvalue them in the second cycle. Even with Hammer descending 4 every turn is going to be better than what a lot of decks are going to get to do with their blues. Your blues are also insanely above rate, having all of these blues that attack for 8 damage. You're going to convert really well in the end game, and your opponent's not going to be able to keep up with that, especially if you're also pitch stacking some of your red threats as well into the second cycle. Your opponent's just going to be completely outvalued, right? So the entire point of this is we control the pace of the game in the first half. Sink Below and Staunch Response also do that into their respective matchups, right? So you probably want these in the mirrors so that you can live longer, get around some dominate style effects, have some reactive style effects. You're obviously going to play this into Azalea. You could consider Staunch into Assassin, but probably not. You're just going to probably want to play Sink Below. And yeah, so that's the current deck list. Let's go over the Maybeboard, right? Warmongers is here. It probably will go in the main board, maybe in the place of Winter's Bite or another blue here. I still think that the meta calls for Warmongers between Runeblades being somewhat popular and also Azalea being somewhat popular, but I can see this card falling a bit out of favor with the deck, especially when you already have really good answers. Like we said, Red Arctic Incarceration is essentially Warmongers into Azalea. I don't know if you need copies 4 through 6. Although, if your local meta is that, you can just never lose to Azalea. If you just play Warmongers plus Red Arctic, what are they ever going to do? Expose the Elements is pretty interesting. I think it's worth playing, probably. You can kill Striders, you can kill some important stuff in the mirror, you can kill Lightning Greaves. This card becomes a little bit worse when your opponents know of its existence, but you actually oddly gain an edge if you're not playing it and your opponent plays around it expecting that you are on it. I think that this probably will come into the list at some point, meta dependent. I think there's some metas where this card isn't as impactful, and there's some where it does do really solid work. I'm leaning more towards no based on what we've seen currently. Like this doesn't kill Traverse, which is really important. Or you can kill Footsteps, but you would prefer that this was able to kill Traverse. If we see something like Verdance pop up a lot more, obviously we would include this to be able to kill Striders or something, but overall I'm just not super impressed with the card, right? You have to consider this is a no block that costs 2, right? So this has to be like a silver bullet. Really, the only time that this card really saw play was during mainly the Starva Oldhim era back in like Everfest, because just killing Crown of Seeds was so important. You would put a -1 counter on their Rampart shield so the Rampart could never block again for the rest of the game, and you killed their crown all in one go. This, in the current state of things, is a little bit worse, right? And we don't have Ice React. We're gonna go into a list of cards I don't like at all, and one of them is Biting Gale. And a big portion of that was missing the Ice React. So you could actually play Exposed with Oldhim, hold priority, having played it, fusing with your Ice card, and then pitch said Ice card to Oldhim's ability, forcing them to put a card from their hand on top of their deck. And then Exposed would finish resolving, and they would have to pay or lose their equipment. If they only have one card left in hand, they can't pay at all, right? Missing that makes this card worse, right? So you have to jump through a lot of hoops, have things line up, have your opponent play into it, and at the end of the day, I think it's really only backbreaking into a few selective decks. Finally, we have Felling, a card that I think could actually see play in this list. You kind of have to think about the fact that you need your first Decompose to be at 4 for this to be good. I think if you're ever sending this as just, a 3 for 4, right? Missing those 4 cards in Banish, I think it really is bad. I think So Tomorrow can kind of fix it a little bit by like putting itself in Banish. So if you, let's say recycle an Oakenold, put the Sotomorrow in Banish, or get your 3 cards in your graveyard, so that way when you play your Felling, it goes straight up to 4 and then it's a 3 for 8, then I think it's playable. And so you could actually try a decomposed version of Jarl, and I have seen some lists attempt it. I'm very skeptical of it for a few reasons. The ice cards are really powerful, and the more you dilute your earth count, the harder it gets to consistently decompose your effects. And if you're ever not decomposing, these cards are awful. However, this is a block 3 that, in the right spots is perfectly playable and incredibly powerful. I think Felling is the best of all the decomposed cards. So, like we talked about earlier, Frostfang's like kind of iffy to me, so maybe you could just run Felling instead of the Frostfang, and maybe it's playable with this configuration, just barely. But man, that is a hard sell, right? We'll have to experiment some more, see the final list, right? Once again, this is super contextual. Maybe we get the full release and all of a sudden Decompose is back on the menu. Maybe the equipment care about it, maybe the weapon cares about it. And then, like we're Felling gaming. But for now, this is in the Maybeboard. And Sludge is here for the mirror. We just need to see what the new weapon is. I'm assuming it's two-handed based off of the art, but we don't know for sure. I made a list of cards I've seen in lists that I don't like, and I'll run through very quickly and try to give my thoughts on all of them. First up is Coronet Peak. Your deck already controls the pace of the game, right? You have so many disruptive attacks. You have CNC, Frostfang, Oakenold if you're in second cycle, Spinal easily if you're in first cycle. You can play Winter's Bite, depending on what the weapon is, that could be disruptive as well. You also have other ways to slow the pace down during your opponent's turn, right? If you're playing into an aggro deck, you have Blizzard, you have Arctic on your turn, you have Hypothermia on your turn, you have Channel Lake Frigid. You don't need to waste an entire card to do no damage to slow down your opponent, right? You pay an entire card to play Winter's Bite. That is what Coronet Peak is. Coronet Peak is Winter's Bite without Go Again. Just play Winter's Bite, give them a Frostbite too, and then send an attack at them as well. You have to kill your opponent, at least with, where the lists are at. Maybe it turns out the weapon costs 4 and we want to play Count Your Blessings Jarl, but currently we don't want to play Coronet Peak, right? If you're building Count Your Blessings Jarl, maybe we revisit this, but for now, this doesn't have Go Again. So you present no damage to your opponent, and they just get to give you a card, and maybe they didn't care anyway. Maybe they have a redundant blue or redundant effect, and you gave up sending damage to your opponent for the hope that it would slow down the pace of the game. But your deck already does that, So I don't find it to be very compelling at all, to be honest. And I think Crown, has a lot of use cases. This one I'm going to catch flack for because I've seen this card spike like crazy on TCG Player. I see everyone including it in their list because it says ice on it. And people were not around when this card was available in the card pool, specifically with Oldhim. Stalagmite, for some reason, is cheaper on TCG Player at the time of making this video than Heart of Ice, for some reason. This card did not see play during Oldhim's time. It did not see play. You will find some lists that did play it, and depending on what time they were from, I would be willing to bet that it was when Tree Frog Dash was a contender in the meta. This was specifically, I believe, around Nats in 2022. There was some weird stuff that was happening in the meta at the time, so this would also be around Worlds. Tree Frog Dash, this like control style list that packed D-reacts to stall out the game long enough to set up an unstoppable item engine, was an absolute silver bullet for Oldhim. So they adapted by adding Heart of Ice, activating it to make all their D-Reacts cost 1, and all of a sudden most of their efficiency went out the window. It was not Kano tech for a few reasons, right? Either the Kano would combo in response and you would be down a resource and not have Tunic, or they would stack you anyway and then it didn't matter, right? You activating the Heart did nothing, and then at the final turns of the game, when you go to activate Heart, they have the entire stack ready to go and you're dead. It could be different now with Kano not being able to stack the same way, but this card is really not that good. Better players will be able to circumnavigate what you're doing with the card. The AB1 is pretty negligible, right? Like, we're already kind of sacking the matchup anyway. Like, we're not even trying to afford AB3. If you want to go to AB3, I'd probably recommend something like Lantern and Null Rune Gloves and keep your Tunic, right? Because your Tunic is what's going to let you play Pummel on your Spinal or your CNC or Frostfang if you're running it. Tunic lets you float 1 during the Wildfire turn to prevent 5 damage. It's more important to me personally that you're able to to push a bunch of damage and then potentially have the 1 up on Tunic. And Heart of Ice, I think, is just too easy to play around. People will mention Enigma. Enigma is another really weird one too, because most of their auras they want to play on their turn anyway. If they're playing defensive auras, they're normally in a bad spot, and if they do need to play a defensive aura, they'll play it in response after weighing the pros and cons of what your hand is. Your hand is pretty telegraphed as a Guardian. You're not really holding any combat tricks. If you blocked with 2 cards and went to your turn, and you're holding 2, and you pitch to use Heart of Ice, it's pretty telegraphed you have a 2 cost, right? So your max output's like 6 damage. They can read on the table, do I need to play Waxing Spectre in response to this to save my mirror guy, right? The math is pretty obviously on the table. The most you're probably going to push is maybe like 8 or something. Like, that's your cap. Could be Oakenold if you're holding 4 cards and you activate Heart of Ice and you're holding 3 cards left in hand, they can maybe read that it's Oakenold. Good players are going to be able to adapt around this card if their strategy is slightly hindered by it. If you're specifically adding this for Kano or for Enigma, I would at least advise you to try out the card a bunch and see where you land on it if you have not bought it already. So when it comes out on Talishar, give it a run, see what you think. This card is really expensive for some reason on TCG Player, and I will tell you, from historical time in the game with 3 ice heroes from their inception to their LL, this card rarely saw play. I think the one time that I actually consistently did see it in some lists was Alexi running it, and even then, once again, it was not that ubiquitous. It was not very common to see this card ran in those lists. It is clunky, and you are always putting yourself down a resource, which is really relevant compared to Tunic putting you up a resource, right? You think about like something like Kano, you would just rather attack them, have the 1 resource that you didn't pay in a Heart of Ice, as well as the 1 resource on your Tunic, and block 10 off a Wildfire with those 2 hypothetical resources, right? When I say 10, I mean that you block 2, and then when the mash shakes out over the combo turn, you prevented 10 damage you would have taken. Helma Eisenpeak, I've seen a few lists. Self-explanatory, don't play that. Tectonic Plating, interesting. I could see an argument for it, right? You are playing some odd cost curve stuff, right? So you got Spinal and CNC, but I don't think you run enough 4 costs to really justify it, right? You're only like looking to use it with Mangle, and that's literally it. Just use your Tunic and pop it for Macho Grande. You don't need tech plating. It feels pretty unnecessary. And for some other cards I've seen, Biting Gale is bad, don't play it. It was not played in Oldhim, and Oldhim could Ice React with the same card that they fused with, right? So they could play the Biting Gale, show you the Earth card fuse, and then Ice React with it as well, which would essentially rip 2 cards from you. Sounds pretty good. It wasn't played. I don't think anything's going to change now. CMH, you're playing 1 attack per turn. You play CMH with 2 cards, and you're playing Guardian, so the general rule of thumb is if you take damage playing Guardian, you're playing wrong most of the time. You need to play like you should never take damage, and CMH wants you to take a lot of damage because you're going to need to keep 2 cards to play it, and then maybe you're going to need to keep 3 cards to actually play something, right? Like if you're going to play Spinal Crush with CMH, you got to keep 5 cards. So yeah, good luck. Good luck eating that entire turn to play Come to Fight on your Spinal and then see how well that turns out for you. I don't think it's very good. I've seen some mix of aura builds trying to play like the tower effects, like Colossal Bearing with all of this. Once again, these are clunky. You can draw them out of order. You can draw them together and they do very little to nothing. It requires you to run a bunch of reds, right? You aren't going to play these in blue because blue Earthlore Empowerment is not going to get your tower effect online for Colossal Bearing. So all of a sudden you're looking at play sets of these in red over what? You know, if you go and look at this list, are you going to give up, you know, CNC, E-Strike, and Spinal for these? I don't think you're going to. Just to destroy an equipment? I don't think that they're very convincing. And I think that they're also very slow and clunky, and they have the same problem as CMH, where that gives your opponent a lot of room to deal a lot of damage to you. You probably should be playing Disruption every single turn and controlling the pace of the game, rather than playing nothing on your turn to telegraph a huge attack that your opponent can punish by getting to keep 5 cards and then playing them all into you, and you need to keep them because you need to bleed Colossal. Earthlore form is tough. I don't think we run enough non-attacks to justify the Earth embodiment. The 2-block is also a big liability. Pulverize has Jarl on it, so people are buying it. This card has really gone back and forth in a lot of Guardian lists. I know some Guardian players like 1 copy, for instance, in the Mirror. I ran 1 copy in the Mirror as Victor for a while, and then eventually I cut it. 10 mana is a lot, and heaving it is always a huge liability. It's a bit easier with Crown of Providence because, you know, you can always dunk it out of your arsenal and keep the heave tokens. It's difficult. Sometimes you'll heave it and you'll draw something more impactful, but you can't play it because, or else the Pulverize is going to rot in your arsenal for the rest of the game. I think it can be okay, and I think maybe 1 copy could be correct, but I probably wouldn't buy it at the current price, and I would never, you know, go above probably like 1 to 2 copies in deck. I really don't even think I'll even be playing it in the Mirror at all. I think we probably have much better options, especially having So Tomorrow and things like that. I've seen some people play Snow Under. Don't do that. Just play an Ice card that doesn't require you to fuse. You don't need to be doing all this. Steadfast is interesting. I think that you probably would rather play Oasis and be proactive into Kano, you know, rather than trying to fatigue them out with like AP4 and Steadfast. I don't think it's super necessary. I think Oasis is your better card. Test of Strength, don't worry about trying to clash with this deck. Your non-attack ratio is pretty high and you don't actually really benefit from clashing at all. I've seen some people talk about Channel the Bleak Expanse. This card was not played in Oldhim at all. Playing it face up is really bad. You would play it in Icelander because you got to play it instant speed, right? So let's say you send Wounded Bullet at your opponent. Your opponent eats 8 damage because they're holding Blood Rush. So they took 8 damage, they go to play their Blood Rush, they discard, and you go in response, and you play the Channel the Bleak Expanse. And then all of a sudden they like literally end their turn. What are they gonna do? They discarded their card, they played their card, they pitched their card, they draw nothing. They do the same thing with the Art of War, right? This card was actually like nichely used in Icelander, especially towards the end of Lexi's run, because they would once again eat an entire card to keep their 3 of a kind, because they're like, oh man, my 3 of a kind turn is gonna be so sick. They go to play the 3 of a kind, you channel the Bleak Expanse, their turn is done. If you play Channel the Bleak Expanse on your turn, there's no mystery for your opponent. They're just going to arsenal their Blood Rush Bellow or pitch it. They're going to not do the thing that Channel Bleak Expanse denies, right? Which is way different than Icelander getting to do it at instant speed. Now, like, there's some niche use cases, like, yeah, you could play this and then attack and your opponent can't block with Traverse, but like, who really cares? The card loses its power when it's played with your opponent's full knowledge, right? Before you're attacking, anything like that, it's just not, it's not worth it. Insidious Chill, we're not fusing, and you don't care about Oakenold having an extra effect on it, right? This card is already insane by itself. It's already ripping your opponent's entire hand. You don't need to take an off turn and have the liability of a 2-block blue in your deck to get extra value out of fusing, because you're not fusing. If you look at this, that's not really something that we're doing. So yeah, so that's a list of cards that I have seen pop up in lists that I have not really understood, or at least I think that there's some theory problems with them. So, you know, maybe don't buy into the hype on like Coronet Peak, something like that. You know, we're not doing financial or, you know, Stackswell advice out here, but it's good to keep that in mind, right? Especially not knowing the full list. We have to be careful, right? Even I could be wrong, right? That's why there's a caveat in here, probably. Because maybe someone comes out and all of a sudden CMH is insane. Maybe the other 3 Majestics are all go again Guardian attacks. Maybe we're CMH slamming our opponent, but that seems unlikely, right? So this is the current iteration of the list. We'll of course tune it as time goes on. We're always open to checking out Earth, Jarl as well, right? They did put both elements on there, right? So you're more than welcome to go and try it out yourself. But this is hopefully a small starting point, somewhere to jump in. Hopefully this made some sense to people. If you have not played Ice Guardian, you know, before, like specifically Oldhim, you might have some fun at the expense of your opponent. But until next time, thank you for watching.